There is a question that has lived inside human beings for as long as we have been capable of asking questions at all. It is not a question that requires a laboratory or a telescope or a degree in anything. It requires only the willingness to sit very still in the quietest room you can find and let your mind do something that it almost never wants to do, which is to reach backward past everything it has ever known, past every memory, past every story it has ever been told, past the first word ever spoken, past the first fire ever lit, past the first ocean wave that ever broke against the first shore, and then keep going, keep reaching, keep moving backward through time, through depth, through silence, through the long, dark corridor of history, until you arrive at the place where all corridors end. And then you reach a wall, not a wall made of stone or metal or anything physical at all, a wall that is simply the absence of anything else, a wall that is not made of matter but of concept, the place where the word before seems to lose its meaning, where the very grammar of the question you are asking begins to dissolve, like a letter left out in the rain until all the ink has run and you can no longer read what it once said. That wall has a name of a sort. Scientists call the event that preceded it the Big Bang. But the wall itself, the moment just before that event, or perhaps more accurately, the place where the word before no longer applies, that wall has no name. It has only silence and questions and the faint, vertiginous feeling you get when you realize that the ground you were standing on was never really there. This is not a video about physics. There will be no equations written across the screen, no numbers large enough to make your eyes glaze over, no attempt to reduce the most profound mystery in the history of human thought down to a set of diagrams and arrows pointing in tidy directions. This is something else. This is an attempt to simply sit with the question, to hold it gently, the way you might hold a piece of sea glass that washed up on a shore you have never visited, turning it over in your fingers, feeling its weight, wondering where it came from and what ocean carried it to you and what shore it was part of before the water broke it free. The question is not new. The question is so old that it predates writing, predates language in any formal sense, predates human civilization entirely. It is quite possible, and perhaps even likely, that somewhere in the deep prehistoric past, a human being sat outside on a cold, clear night and stared up at the sky, and felt, without words to describe it, the same vertiginous feeling that you might feel if you really let this question in. The same quiet terror, the same bottomless curiosity, the same sense that the universe is somehow larger than the mind that is trying to think about it, that the container is always smaller than whatever it is trying to contain. And yet, we keep asking. We keep reaching back. We keep pressing our hands against that wall in the dark, feeling for a crack, a seam, a door that might open onto something we have never seen. This is the story of that reaching. This is the story of that wall. And this is perhaps the story of why the question itself might matter more than any answer we could ever hope to find. Before we go any further, there is something important to acknowledge, something that most explanations of this subject tend to skip over in their eagerness to get to the science or the philosophy or whatever answer they have decided to offer. And it is this: the fact that you are able to ask this question at all is itself one of the strangest things in the universe. Think about that for a moment. You are a collection of matter, atoms, molecules, cells, electrochemical signals moving through a network of tissue, and somehow, through a process that nobody fully understands, This collection of matter has organized itself in such a way that it is capable of wondering about its own origin. It is capable of reaching backward through time in its imagination and asking what came before the moment that made the moment, that eventually, after 14 billion years of extraordinary and improbable complexity, produced the particular arrangement of matter that is you, sitting here, thinking about this. That is, if you slow down long enough to really feel it, an almost unbearably strange thing to be true. The universe made something, and that something turned around and asked where the universe came from. The river produced a creature that walked to the river's source and stood there, looking at the spring, and said, "But where does the water come from before it becomes the spring?" And in asking that question, the creature found, perhaps to its relief and perhaps to its quiet despair, that there was no easy answer, that the springs seemed to emerge from somewhere that the word somewhere could not quite reach. We are that creature, and this is that question. Let us try to describe what we think we know, not in the language of science, but in the language of experience. Let us try to translate the abstract into something that the body can feel as well as the mind can process, because that is, ultimately, how human beings actually understand things, not through numbers alone, but through the marriage of the numerical and the felt. Approximately 14 billion years ago, though that number, like all very large numbers, is really just a sound we make when we want to gesture at a duration that exceeds our ability to truly imagine it. The universe, as we understand it, came into a state of being that it had not previously been in. In the first extraordinary fraction of the first second of that event, everything that would eventually become everything else, every star, every galaxy, every ocean, every mountain, every living creature, every thought, every song, every moment of love and grief and beauty and terror that has ever occurred or ever will occur, existed in a state of unimaginable compression and heat and density, all of it crowded together in a space so small that the word small barely applies to it. It was not an explosion, exactly, despite the dramatic name we have given it. It was not an explosion in the way that a bomb is an explosion, something that occurs inside a larger space, pushing outward against an ambient environment. There was no ambient environment. There was no larger space for it to explode into. Space itself, the very medium through which things move and exist at distances from one another, was part of what was expanding. The universe was not expanding into something. The universe was something that was, itself, expanding, with all of space and time being created as it went. This is already the kind of thought that, if you sit with it long enough, begins to feel like trying to hold water in your hands. The harder you grip, the more it slides through. We are accustomed to things existing inside space. We are accustomed to events happening inside time. And here we are, being asked to consider a moment at which space and time were themselves being born. Which means that whatever was happening at that moment was not happening inside anything. It was not happening at a particular place. It was not happening at a particular time. It was, in some sense, the happening that made place and time possible in the first place. And before that moment, here is where the architecture of language begins to creak and groan under the weight of what we are trying to build. Because before is a word that exists inside time. Before breakfast, before the war, before you were born. All of these befores point to a moment that is earlier in a sequence that exists within the flow of time, one moment following another in an ordered progression. But if time itself began at or around the Big Bang, then asking what came before the Big Bang is a bit like asking what lies to the north of the North Pole. It is not that the answer is hidden or difficult to find. It is that the question, applied to that particular geography, stops making the kind of sense that geography normally makes. This is not a deflection. This is not a scientist or a philosopher saying, "We don't know, so let's pretend the question doesn't count." It is something more interesting and more subtle than that. It is the recognition that our questions are built from the same materials as our experience, and our experience has always and only occurred inside time. Every question we have ever asked has been asked inside a universe where time already existed. We have no experience of a timeless state, no memory of existing outside of sequence, no intuition to draw on when we try to imagine what before time could possibly mean. We are, in this sense, like people who have lived their entire lives on a flat plane, trying to imagine what it would mean to walk off the edge of a sphere. Not off the edge into nothing, but off the edge and simply continue walking, and find that the edge never comes, because there is no edge, because the sphere has no boundary, because the geometry of the thing is fundamentally different from the geometry we are used to. And yet, and this is the part that I find quietly extraordinary, the question persists. Despite being told that it may not be a meaningful question in the conventional sense, despite being given very sophisticated philosophical and mathematical reasons why "before the beginning" might be a phrase without a referent, human beings keep asking it. We cannot seem to help ourselves. Why is that? Perhaps it is because we are, at our core, creatures of narrative. We understand things as stories. We understand stories as having beginnings, middles, and ends. And crucially, we understand beginnings as being preceded by something. Every story begins with a world that already exists. Every character arrives into circumstances that were already in motion before they arrived. Every "once upon a time" implies a time that came before the once. It is baked into the very structure of how we think, how we communicate, how we make meaning from the raw material of experience. To be told that the universe's story has a beginning that is not preceded by anything, that there is no once before the once upon a time, is to be asked to step outside the narrative structure entirely. And for creatures who live inside narrative the way fish live inside water, that is not a comfortable place to be. It does not feel like an answer. It feels like a missing page. And so, we keep looking. We keep turning the book over in our hands, feeling the binding, pressing our fingers into the gap where the missing page might once have been attached, wondering if perhaps it is not missing after all, only hidden, only folded into itself in a way we have not yet learned to unfold. There are those within the scientific community who have proposed models of reality in which the Big Bang was not, in fact, a true beginning, in which something preceded it, or in which it was one phase of an eternal cycle, or in which it emerged from a pre-existing state that was itself outside of time as we experience it. These models are fascinating, not because they are proven, but because they are possible, because they represent the human mind's extraordinary refusal to accept that there is a door it cannot open. Every time we are told that a particular door has no handle, no keyhole, no crack around its edges through which even light can pass, we find ourselves drawn to it. We press our hands against it. We listen for sounds on the other side. This is not irrationality. This is something more like the defining characteristic of consciousness itself, the peculiar, relentless, beautiful insistence on reaching past what can be reached. Let us linger here for a moment in the architecture of the problem itself, because there is something beautiful about a problem's structure, independent of whether the problem can be solved. When philosophers and scientists talk about the beginning of the universe, they are often very quickly drawn into debates about causality, about the principle that every effect must have a cause, about the intuition, so deep it feels almost like a physical sensation, that nothing can come from nothing. The Latin phrase is ex nihilo nihil fit. From nothing, nothing comes. This idea is older than science. It predates the telescope, the microscope, the printing press. It is woven into the thinking of ancient civilizations across every continent, every tradition, every attempt that human beings have ever made to understand why anything exists rather than nothing. If nothing can come from nothing, then the universe, which clearly exists, must have come from something. And that something must have come from something else. And that something else must have come from something before it. And so, we are back on the long road, the infinite corridor, the chain of causation stretching backward through time without end. Unless, and here is the turn that many philosophers have taken, at many different points in history, in many different forms, unless the chain does not stretch backward infinitely, but instead curves, loops, returns to itself, unless causation, at its deepest level, is not a straight line, but a circle, unless the universe, in some sense that we cannot yet fully articulate, causes itself. This is not a comfortable idea. It has the quality of a dream logic, the kind of thing that seems to make sense at 3 a.m., but feels slippery in the light of day. But it is worth sitting with, because it represents a genuinely different way of thinking about what existence means. It suggests that existence might not be something that was handed to the universe from outside, from some pre-existing cause, some prior state, some earlier condition, but something that the universe simply has, the way a circle simply is, not created, not preceded, simply the shape of what is. One of the things that I find most affecting about the question of what came before the Big Bang is not the question itself, but the response of the universe to that question, which is to say, the complete, total, unbroken, infinite silence. The universe does not answer. It has never answered. It will never answer. Not because it is hiding the truth, not because there is some cosmic mechanism of concealment at work, but because the universe is not a thing that answers questions. It is not a speaker. It is not a listener. It does not, in any sense that the word ordinarily implies, care. Not about the question, not about the questioner, not about whether the questioner ever finds peace or resolution or a moment of clarity that makes the restlessness stop. The universe is a machine of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary scale, and it runs. That is what it does. It runs. Stars ignite and burn and collapse. Galaxies drift apart from one another in the slow recession that has been in progress since the very beginning. Black holes pull matter into silences so absolute that not even light can escape them. Planets form from the debris of dead stars, and on some of those planets, under conditions that we barely understand, chemistry becomes biology. Biology becomes awareness, and awareness becomes a species that stands in the dark and asks, "Where did all of this come from?" And the machine keeps running. There is something about this indifference that I think we need to sit with more than we typically do. We tend, as a culture, to either rage against it or romanticize it. We tell ourselves that the universe is cold and hostile, that existence is absurd, that the silence in response to our questions is a kind of cruelty. or we swing in the other direction and tell ourselves that we are cosmically significant, that our questions are somehow proof of our special status, that the universe is in some sense aware of us because we are aware of it. Both of these responses are, I think, attempts to make the indifference bearable, to give it a human face, whether that face is cruel or kind. Because a face we can look at, even a frightening one, is less disorienting than no face at all. But what if we tried, just for a little while, to let the indifference be what it actually is? Not cruel, not kind, not meaningful, not meaningless, but simply what is there? What if we let the silence be silence without immediately filling it with our own voices, our own interpretations, our own need to make the universe about us in some way? The question of what came before the Big Bang is, in this light, not just a question about cosmology. It is a question about the limits of what the universe is willing, or more precisely, able, to tell us about itself. And those limits are not arbitrary. They are not the result of our instruments being too crude or our mathematics being too primitive, though those things may also be true. They are, in a deeper sense, structural. They are built into the nature of what the universe is, because the universe, in the most fundamental sense, is a system that generates information about itself as it evolves. Stars emit light that carries information about their composition. Particles interact in ways that leave traces. Events cause other events, and the causal chain can, in principle, be followed backward, but only within the system, only within the universe that already exists. The moment before the universe existed is not a moment within the system. It is not, strictly speaking, a moment at all, and so the system cannot generate information about it. The machine cannot report on the time before it was switched on. This is not a failure. This is a boundary. And boundaries, even when they frustrate us, have their own kind of integrity. There is something almost admirable about a limit that is so fundamental, so deeply built into the architecture of what is possible, that it cannot be circumvented by any amount of cleverness or ingenuity or desire. It is, in its way, honest. The universe is telling us, as clearly as it is capable of telling us anything, here and not further, this far and no more. The wall is not hiding anything. The wall is simply the wall, and yet we keep returning to it. We keep pressing our hands against the cold stone, feeling for the seam, the crack, the breath of air from the other side. Not because we are irrational, but because we are, at our most fundamental level, the part of the universe that asks. We are the machine's question about itself, and the question, it turns out, is larger than the machine. There is a particular flavor of loneliness that belongs to this question that does not quite belong to any other question. It is not the loneliness of being in a crowd of strangers. It is not even the loneliness of grief, of being the only one who still remembers a particular person in a particular way. It is something more fundamental. It is the loneliness of being a conscious thing in a universe that preceded consciousness by an almost incomprehensible span of time, and that will follow consciousness when consciousness eventually ceases to exist, by an equally incomprehensible span. Consciousness is, in the life of the universe, an extraordinarily brief flicker. The universe was dark for a very long time before the first stars lit. It was lifeless for a very long time before chemistry assembled itself into something that could reproduce and adapt and eventually perceive. It has been aware, through us, through whatever other aware creatures may exist elsewhere in its vast and patient body, for an astonishingly small fraction of its total duration. And when the last star burns out and the last black hole evaporates, and the last quantum fluctuation in a cold and empty universe disturbs the silence for the last time before the silence becomes absolute. Consciousness will be a memory that the universe no longer holds. Because the universe does not hold memories. The universe is not the kind of thing that remembers. And so we are here, in this narrow corridor of awareness, this improbable, fragile, extraordinary window of consciousness set into the wall of an otherwise dark and silent building, asking where the building came from, pressing our faces against the glass of the present moment, trying to see backward through a darkness that precedes even light itself. This is not a tragedy, or rather, it is a tragedy only if we insist that things must care about us in order to matter. There is another way of looking at it, a way that I think is available to us, even if it takes a certain kind of quietness to find, in which the asking itself is the thing, in which the reaching is the point, not the grasping, in which the question is not a problem to be solved, but a place to be inhabited. Here is something that I have been circling around and would like to now approach directly, with the same gentleness that the subject seems to require. There is a sense in which the question, what existed before the Big Bang, is not really a question about what the universe was doing before it became the universe. It is a question about the nature of existence itself, about whether existence is something that happens or something that simply is, about whether nothing is a real thing that can exist in its own right, a genuine absence, a true emptiness, or whether nothing is simply a word we use for the space between things that we haven't looked at closely enough yet. Philosophers have worried at this question from many different directions for a very long time. Leibniz asked it plainly and famously, why is there something rather than nothing? And this question, which sounds almost like a child's question, which sounds almost too simple to be worth asking, is in fact one of the deepest questions it is possible to ask. Because the moment you sit with it, really sit with it, really feel the weight of it, you realize that it is not asking for a scientific answer. It is not asking for a date or a mechanism or a set of initial conditions. It is asking something more fundamental. It is asking why the category of things that exist is not empty. And that question cannot be answered from inside existence, because any answer you give will itself be a thing that exists and thus will assume the very existence it is trying to explain. It is the most complete and perfect circular problem that has ever been posed. Unless, and this is the place where I find the most unexpected kind of comfort, or at least the most unexpected kind of peace, unless the question itself is the answer. Not in a mystical sense, not in a hand-waving sense, but in a specific and interesting sense. Consider, if there were nothing, truly nothing, in the most absolute sense of the word, there would be no question. There would be no questioner. There would be no wondering about why there was nothing rather than something. The fact that the question exists is, itself, evidence of its own answer. Not complete evidence, not satisfying evidence, not the kind of evidence that makes the vertigo go away, but a small, quiet, real piece of something. The question arises from existence. The question proves existence. And existence, however mysterious, is what we have. There is another angle on this that I find even more affecting, and it has to do with what consciousness actually is, or at least what it might be in relation to the universe that produced it. We tend to think of ourselves as separate from the universe, as beings who exist inside it, who look at it from a position of observation, who are subject to its laws but not constitutive of it. The universe is the stage. We are on the stage. The stage existed before we arrived and will continue after we leave. But there is a different way of thinking about this that has a long history in both philosophy and in certain branches of contemporary science. And it goes like this. Consciousness is not something that happened to the universe accidentally. It is not a random byproduct of complexity that the universe produced inadvertently and doesn't particularly know what to do with. Consciousness may be, in some sense, the universe's way of knowing itself, not in a supernatural sense, not as a claim about cosmic purpose or divine intention. Simply as an observation, the universe, without us, would exist, but would not know that it existed. It would have no perspective on itself. It would have no inside view. It would be, in a sense, entirely external to itself, all surface, no depth, all event with no witness. We are the witness. We are the inside view. When we look up at the stars, the universe is, through our eyes, seeing itself. When we ask where the universe came from, the universe is, through our minds, asking about its own origin. And when we reach backward to that wall, that place where time runs out and the question before loses its footing, the universe is, through our restlessness, pressing against its own most fundamental limit. This does not explain the origin of the universe. It does not dissolve the mystery or fill the silence with sound. But it changes something about the quality of the silence. It makes the silence feel less like an absence and more like the pause between breaths, the moment of suspension before an inhale or exhale, when the lungs are neither filling nor emptying, and the body is, for that instant, completely still. Let us stay here for a little while. This image you are looking at, this almost not their texture in the darkness, is, in a very real and technical sense, the oldest thing that can be seen. It is the afterglow of the universe's first light. It is the relic heat of a moment so early in the life of everything that the universe was still, in many ways, becoming what it would eventually be. It has been traveling since before the first stars existed. It has passed through the birth and death of countless generations of suns. It has crossed distances that the human mind cannot meaningfully hold. And it ended here, in your eyes, or in a photograph that eventually reached your eyes. The oldest light in the universe, arriving at a consciousness that is aware of its age, aware of its distance, aware of its fragile and extraordinary beauty. There is a kind of love in that, if you are willing to use the word loosely enough. Not a personal love, not a love directed at you or at us or at any particular thing, but the love that is in the fact of connection, the love that is in the thread that runs from the beginning of everything to this particular moment, this particular awareness, this particular act of looking and wondering and feeling the weight of the distance. When we ask what came before the Big Bang, we are asking what came before this thread. We are asking whether the thread has an end, or whether it loops back on itself, or whether it simply, impossibly, peacefully begins. And the thread does not answer, but it is still there, still running, still connecting the almost nothing of that first moment to the very specific, very tender, very strange something of right now. I want to say something about the feeling of being a human being who has inherited this question, because I think there is something important in the inheritance itself, in the fact that this question did not begin with you, was not invented by you, and will not end with you. Every civilization that has ever existed on this planet has had some version of this question at its center. Every tradition, every mythology, Every cosmological system that human beings have ever devised has grappled, in one way or another, with the problem of origins. Not because we are all asking the same question in the same way. We are clearly not. But because the question, in all its forms, seems to be something that consciousness cannot help but generate. It is what awareness does when it looks at itself from the right angle. It asks where it came from. And there is something moving about the fact that every attempt to answer this question, whether through myth, through philosophy, through religion, through science, has added something to the conversation, even when it has not resolved it. The Hindu cosmological cycles of creation and dissolution. The Judeo-Christian concept of a creation event initiated by divine will. The ancient Greek speculation about primordial chaos and the forces that ordered it. The Norse myths of the void before creation, the great emptiness between worlds. The Aboriginal Australian stories of the dream time, a before beginning that is not really a before, but a different kind of presence, woven through the fabric of what is rather than preceding it. All of these are, in their different ways, attempts by human consciousness to do exactly what we are doing here, to press hands against the wall, to feel for the seam, to listen for the sound from the other side. None of them have the answer in any final, conclusive sense, but all of them have, I think, made the question richer, more layered, more inhabitable. We are standing on the shoulders of every consciousness that has ever stared at the sky and wondered. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. If we are going to press our hands against the beginning of time, it seems only honest to also stand at the other end, to project forward, not just backward, to look toward the last horizon as well as the first, because the universe, we have learned, does not last forever. Not in its current form, not with its current contents. The stars that fill the night sky, those warm, generous, ancient engines of light and heat, are burning through fuel that cannot be replenished indefinitely. Eventually, over spans of time that make the current age of the universe seem brief by comparison, they will one by one exhaust themselves and go cold. The last red dwarf star, the most miserly and long-lived of all stellar types, will eventually burn its last hydrogen and collapse. And when it does, there will be no new star to take its place. The era of stars, the era in which the universe is the kind of place where light and heat exist at any significant scale, will end. After that, the universe will enter what some have poetically called the degenerate era, when the only large objects remaining will be the cold remnants of former stars, white dwarfs cooling to darkness, neutron stars slowing their rotation over the eons, black holes drifting through an increasingly empty cosmos, consuming the stray matter that comes within their reach. This era will last far, far longer than the era of stars, longer than our minds can begin to approach in any meaningful sense. And through all of that extraordinary duration, nothing will happen that we would recognize as event, as drama, as change in any human sense of the word. And after that, eventually, even black holes will end. Very slowly, over periods of time that beggar every unit of measurement we have ever invented, black holes radiate away their mass and dissolve, each one ending not with a roar, but with a final, infinitesimally small emission of energy. The last warmth, the last light, the last event in the history of what we might loosely call structure. And then there is only what physicists call the heat death. Not death by heat, the opposite in fact. An endless, cold, perfectly uniform distribution of energy across an infinite space. No gradients, no flows, No differences in temperature or density or structure that would allow anything to happen. Perfect equilibrium. Perfect stillness. The universe in its final state. Not nothing, technically. The energy is still there, but nothing that can do anything. Nothing that can change. Nothing that can generate information or complexity or awareness. A silence so complete that it makes the silence at the beginning seem, by comparison, almost noisy. And here is the question that the end of the universe poses in mirror to the question of the beginning. What comes after? After the last event? After the last flicker? After the final erasure of the last difference that remained? When the universe has arrived at maximum entropy and sits in its cold, dark, uniform stillness for an eternity of eternities, what then? The question, what comes after, has the same grammar problem as the question, what came before? After implies time. Time implies sequence. Sequence implies events. But in a universe that has reached its final equilibrium, there are no events. Time, in any meaningful sense, has no direction, no flow, no content. Whether it continues to pass in some abstract sense, nobody can say, but it no longer matters if it does, because there is nothing happening within it. And so the end, in some ways, rhymes with the beginning. Both are states of such absolute uniformity that the concepts of time, of change, of event become, at their extreme, meaningless. The universe begins in a state of such extreme compression and heat that the distinctions we are used to don't apply. It ends in a state of such extreme expansion and cold that the distinctions don't apply again, for entirely different reasons. Something from nothing, and then, eventually, nothing from something. It is as if the universe is a parenthesis in a text that has no other words, two brackets with extraordinary complexity between them, suspended in a surrounding silence that is on both ends absolute, and we are a small note written in the middle of that parenthesis, very faint, very brief, very strange, wondering about the margins. But here's the thing I want to say about that parenthesis, about that middle, about the extraordinary, improbable, fragile, temporary complexity that fills the space between the featureless beginning and the featureless end. It matters, not because the universe says it matters, not because there is some external ledger in which the value of these events is recorded, not because awareness will be preserved somewhere, somehow, to look back on all of this and say, yes, this was worth it. There is no such preservation. There is no such ledger. The indifference is real, and it is complete. And yet, the color of a sunset, the weight of grief, the moment of recognition when someone says something true and something in you responds before you have decided to respond, because the body knows before the mind does. The particular way that light falls on water in the late afternoon of a certain kind of autumn day and makes you feel, for no reason you can explain, that you have been here before and will be here again, even though you know that neither of these things is likely to be true. These things happened. They are real. They occurred in the parenthesis. And the fact that the parenthesis closes and that the text surrounding it is silent and that there is nobody outside the text to read it, none of that reaches back into the parenthesis and unmakes what was inside it. The sunset still happened. The grief was still real. The recognition still occurred. This is not a consolation. It is not meant to make anything easier, and I suspect it does not. But it is, I think, a form of honesty, a form of looking at what is actually there without flinching from it and without reaching for something softer to hold on to. What came before the Big Bang? We do not know. We may never know. The question may not be in the end, a meaningful question. Or it may be the most meaningful question we have, precisely because it cannot be answered. What comes after the end of the universe? More or less the same. And in between, this, all of this, the extraordinary, ridiculous, heartbreaking, gorgeous weight of everything in between. I want to end here without ending. I want to leave you in this room without showing you the door. Not because I am being evasive, and not because I think ambiguity is more sophisticated than clarity, but because I genuinely believe that this particular question, this ancient, bottomless, quietly devastating question about what lay on the other side of the beginning, deserves to remain open, deserves to remain inhabited rather than resolved. The universe does not owe us an answer. It never has. And we do not owe the universe our peace of mind. We are allowed to carry the question. We are allowed to let it sit with us in the dark, neither solved nor abandoned, neither fully understood nor fully relinquished. We are allowed to hold uncertainty gently, the way you hold a sleeping animal, carefully, with attention, without gripping. There is a particular kind of courage in this that we do not usually recognize as courage. We tend to think of courage as the willingness to act in the face of danger, or to speak in the face of silence, or to persist in the face of failure. But there is another kind of courage that is quieter and, in some ways, more difficult. The courage to not know and to remain in the not knowing without filling it prematurely with something more comfortable. The courage to let the question be larger than any answer. The courage to stand at the wall and not need it to open. You are made, as every living thing is made, from matter that was forged in the cores of stars that died billions of years before the earth existed. You are made from the universe that came before you, and you will, in whatever small and scattered way, contribute matter to the universe that comes after you. The atoms that are currently arranged in the particular configuration that constitutes you were once inside a star, and before that, inside a cloud of gas drifting between galaxies, and before that, inside the primordial matter of the universe's earliest moments, the closest our matter has ever been to whatever came before. You are not separate from the question. You are part of the question. The universe's matter is asking about the universe's beginning through the extraordinary, improbable medium of you. Some of the most interesting thinkers who have spent serious time with this problem have arrived at a tentative conclusion, not an answer, but a conclusion about the nature of the question that I find quietly remarkable. And it is this: the question, what came before the Big Bang, may be a question that is shaped by our experience of time, and may therefore not apply in the same way to a state that is outside of time. Not because the answer is hidden, but because the question itself is, in a sense, asking about a territory using a map that was drawn for a different territory entirely. In that view, the question is not wrong, exactly. It is the right impulse applied to the wrong grammar. It is the correct instinct, the instinct to trace causation backward, to follow the thread, to find the source, encountering a place where causation itself changes shape, where the thread doesn't break exactly, but becomes something for which thread is not quite the right word anymore. This does not close the question. It opens it differently. And opening it differently is, I think, all we can ask of any question this profound. Not to be answered, but to be opened differently. To reveal new rooms behind doors we thought were walls. To show us that the territory is larger, stranger, and more generous than the map we were using to navigate it. If you were to walk outside tonight, if you were to go somewhere dark enough that the sky reveals itself in something like its full depth, and you were to tilt your head back and look up, you would be looking at light that left its sources years ago, decades ago, centuries and millennia, and in some cases, millions of years ago. You would be, in a very literal sense, looking at the past. The sky is a time machine, and it is always running, and you can access it simply by being willing to stand in the dark and look up. And somewhere above you, in every direction, in fact, in the furthest reaches of what any telescope has ever been able to reach, is the faint warmth of the oldest light, the cosmic microwave background, the afterglow of the first moment that could meaningfully be called a moment, the closest thing we have to a photograph of the universe's earliest state, blurred, faded, almost inaudible, like a voice on a very old recording, but still there, still carrying information from the edge of the beginning. Look at it, if you can. Look at the place where our knowledge ends and the silence begins. Look at the wall, not with frustration or despair, but with the particular tenderness that is appropriate for things that are very old and very large and very beyond us. You are made from what preceded that wall, one way or another. Whatever came before the beginning made you too, in whatever indirect and traceable way connects the before to the now. You are, in your atoms, if not in your awareness, older than the universe as we know it. Or, alternatively, you are exactly as old as the universe, which is to say, the question of your own beginning and the question of the universe's beginning are, at their deepest level, versions of the same question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why are you here rather than not here? These questions are, in the end, the same question, and the same silence answers both. And so we find ourselves, at the end of all this reaching and looking and pressing of hands against walls, more or less where we began, standing at the threshold of a question that does not fully resolve, holding it in the way you hold something delicate, with open hands rather than closed ones. What existed before the Big Bang? Perhaps nothing, in the most radical sense of the word. A true absence from which existence somehow emerged, for reasons that may be formally unanswerable. Perhaps something, a prior state of the universe, a cycle of expansion and contraction, a quantum condition without dimension or duration from which our particular universe crystallized like frost forming on cold glass. Perhaps the question does not apply. Perhaps before is a concept that has no grip on a state outside of time, and the universe, in some deep sense, simply is without beginning or end in any temporal meaning of those words. Perhaps the question is not yet framed correctly, and the answer awaits a shift in understanding so fundamental that we cannot yet imagine the shape of it. The same way that a person who has never heard music cannot imagine what a chord sounds like, even if you describe every frequency in perfect detail. All of these are possible. None of them are settled. And in the space between them, in the wide, dark, humming silence between all possible answers, lives the most honest and most human response available to us. We don't know, and we keep asking. And this, in the end, this particular dance of reaching and not quite grasping, this endless circling of the question without landing on the answer, this willingness to stand at the wall and simply be there, present, attentive, alive to the mystery, may be the closest thing to an answer that consciousness, in its current form, is capable of. It is not nothing. It is perhaps exactly what we are for.